first of all, the top part of our screen essentially has two sections to it that I want you guys to focus on. The top half of this bar, so all of this here, you can think of for now as your view and render controls. So things like your standard views or elevations are located here. So I have all of my different elevations that I can switch between at the top here. These can also be accessed via the numpad or number pad on your keyboards as a shortcut. So if I press the different numbers, it switches to different elevations by pressing the numbers on the numpad. Whichever you find easier is fine. I don't tend to use numpads that much, but some of you guys might find that an easier approach. There are a lot of options on Vectorworks, as you can see, especially at the top, on the top bar of the screen. But for now, we're looking at the elevations on that side, as well as just underneath it, the perspectives, which is this button here. So different perspectives you can look at your model from. Now, some of you might be familiar with this just because we have a lot of people who have just done SketchUp with, but to give you an explanation again, the orthogonal view is as if you were looking at something with no field of view or peripheral vision. Everything above that means your camera angle gets wider and wider. So this, for example, is your front view on orthogonal. If I were to do a wide perspective, this is also front view, but with a wider camera angle. So the rule of thumb here is, generally speaking, the tighter the space, the wider the camera needs to be, is the idea with perspectives. So if you're viewing a very small room, you need a very wide camera angle to get everything in shot. The normal perspective is as close as you can get to a human perspective. If you want to view something as a person would normally see it, you would normally be working with a normal perspective camera. However, the wide perspective is still feasible and won't tend to distort your view too much. There is also a custom perspective underneath that where you can do increments that are wider or thinner field of views from that. So essentially, as it says on the tooltip there, the lower value you enter, the wider your perspective. So if you go all the way down to 1, you're going to get a very distorted, very wide angle camera. So if you want to slightly tweak it, you can tweak it to get the perfect camera angle that you would like to use. We're not going to worry too much about oblique camera angles right now because they're not going to be particularly important. And to be honest, it's going to cause more confusion than anything else. They are also perspective views, just in a slightly different format. So I would recommend, if you would like to use oblique camera angles, then that can be a little bit of homework in between sessions to have a look into them. But essentially, you're splitting it into orthogonal, which is no perspective, and your narrow, normal, and wide, which are your field of view perspectives. Like I said, a lot of this may be fairly similar depending on what the background you're coming from in terms of your software history usage. So these are the two main view controls we are going to be using at the top here. The other thing I would like you to bear in mind in terms of this bar at the top is the little teapot symbol. This is your render mode that you are currently using. Now, there are two default render modes in Vectorworks that you can switch between, and those are shaded and wireframe. So wireframe is basically X-ray view. All of the faces become see-through. It can be useful in certain examples. If you want to see the interior of a drawing or what you're trying to do, wireframe could be quite cool. However, to be honest, I don't tend to work in it that much. I think a lot of the time, especially with more complex applications, it's more confusing than anything else. So most of the time you want to be in shaded render mode. There are a number of different render styles. Now, we're not that interested in rendering, especially at this point in the course. That's more of something we go on to in an intermediate to advanced approach. However, to give you a quick breakdown, under RenderWorks styles, there are a load of presets that you can explore later on with your own models. Things like artistic RenderWorks styles with like pencils, paintbrushes, pens, that sort of thing, if you want to do a sketch, or realistic render modes if you want to have a more realism approach to your visuals. where you can do lighting, high quality textures, reflections, all that sort of thing. And you will also notice Redshift at the bottom if you're on one of the newer versions of the software. And to keep it really simple for now, not that you need to remember this, but Redshift and Renderworks are the two different render engines in Vectorworks. So Vectorworks actually has two renderers built into it. Renderworks is Cinema 4D, and Redshift is its own company. Redshift is Redshift, but two different renderers built into here. And again, at this point, it's probably going to be of least importance to you guys to remember this, but the difference between the two when you come to choosing them is Renderworks relies on your CPU of your computer, so your processor, and Redshift is your video card. If you're using a computer with a video card, your renders will be much quicker using Redshift. A huge difference, in fact. Let's say a Renderworks realistic visual takes 20 minutes to render an image. Redshift might take 20 seconds to render that image. So massive difference if you have a video card. If you are on a Mac, then you don't have a video card anyway, because Macs are Macs and they're weird. Yeah. If you're using a Windows, it's going to make a huge difference. On a Mac, it probably won't make as much of a noticeable time difference to you. But yeah, we do not need to worry about rendering for now. The main thing you need to remember is the two default modes, wireframe and shaded. The second part of this bar that I want to mention is the lower half of it, a very thin half of the bar. Now, this is going to be probably where you're going to be spending most of your time when you're drawing. So there's only a few options here at the moment, but you'll notice as I switch tools, the options there change. So this is called your option bar or your mode bar. Now, any options with the current tool you are using are always displayed on this section of the bar there. For example, if I click on, let's say, a rectangle, all of my rectangle options now appear on that bar here. So if ever a tool you're using isn't doing what you expect, or you want to change the settings it's working with, you're going to be looking at this left-hand section of your screen at the top. This is your option bar. In practice, I will keep mentioning all of these things. You're not expected to memorize them. I just want to familiarize you a bit with what's going on here. So options and views at the top, and then just underneath it is your mode bar or option bar for the settings of the tool you are currently using. So we have our standard views, like we said, or elevations, and we have our different perspectives we're going to be working with. Now I'm going to talk you through the camera controls that you're going to be needing, and then you guys can have a little play around with it. So the manual controls you guys need to know about. Very similar to a lot of programs. There are three. The first is fairly simple. It's zooming. So the only things you need to know about zooming are, first of all, it zooms in wherever you're hovered. So you put your cursor over your target and zoom in and out on that spot. The other thing about zooming is at the top of your screen here, there is a fit to objects. If you're ever too far zoomed in or zoomed out, that will get you back to where you need to be. Because it's a very common problem when you first start using 3D. People end up in the void of not seeing anything. Happens all the time. So zooming, fairly simple. There's not too much you have to worry about. The other two modes you're going to be using are pan and orbit. So these can be accessed on the basic tool palette with this tool and this tool here. You have the pan tool, which is the hand, and then you have the flyover tool, which I always call orbit, but I suppose it's called flyover. And you can either click on them and access them via that basic tool set. The pan tool will move your screen left, up and down. And the orbit tool will move your camera, so rotate your camera. Now, there are a few things you guys need to know about this. So I'll show you these options and then I'll let you guys have a play around with it. The first thing you need to know is that you can access all of these via the roller on your mouse. So as with any design software, much easier and quicker to access any of these camera controls via the roller on a mouse. If you don't have a roller mouse, get one. It's going to make your life easier. So to pan, you hold Shift and push the roller down, and that will pan your camera. And it means you don't have to switch in and out of different tools that you are using. You can also click the roller down and use left mouse button instead of holding shift if you want to. So it saves you having to use your hand on the keyboard. Depending on the setup of your machine and with Vectorworks, you can also try and just push the roller down on its own. That might well be set to pan. That's dependent on versions though. So the roller on its own, if that works, that's fine. You don't need to hold any extra keys, but if you do, it will be shift on the keyboard. To orbit your camera, very similar. All you do is you push the roller down and you hold control. So control and the roller will orbit your camera. Right. So the three functions you need are zoom and orbit. Now, orbit on Vectorworks can work in quite a few different ways. So something I want you guys to check out and have a little play around with here is if you click on the flyover tool or the orbit tool, there will be some options available on your mode bar at the top. And these are very much worth checking out. There are basically three different functions you can use, or three different ways you can orbit the camera. And they'll significantly affect the efficiency that you are drawing at. So the first of them is view center mode. So this little tool here. This means that when you're orbiting your camera, it will orbit around the middle of your screen, which a lot of the time is fine, not too bad. The second mode is interactive origin, whereby you click somewhere, let's say over here, and then that becomes the middle of my rotation. And the third of them, the third mode even, is object center mode. And that means that anything you are selected on becomes the center of your orbit function. Now, depending on what you're trying to do, depends on the flyover or orbit mode you would like to have active at that point in time. I quite often like object center because it means that when nothing is selected, then the center of my view becomes my focus for my orbit function. But then if I want to, let's say, work on this house, then I can very easily select it and then orbit very cleanly around that selection. So object center is my personal kind of preference, but you might find it doesn't work for you and you want to use something else. So do check out the different flyover modes and have a go with them and see what you find easiest. So just for a couple of minutes, I want you guys to have a little go with the different navigation tools. So zoom, pan, orbit, the different perspectives, different elevation views, and the different flyover modes we've just talked about, just to get comfortable with working within this space. And if any questions do crop up, then feel free to ask that as well, obviously. Have a little play around with it. Just make sure you get comfortable with it as you go. And then I will introduce a few more little navigational tool tips for you. So a couple of extra shortcuts for you guys to try out just while you're having a go with that. The first one, I'll start with the least useful out of the three that I'm going to show you, but you might as well know them all. So Z means if you hover over something and press the Z key on your keyboard, it does something called super zoom, which is slightly strange. It does like an X-ray super zoomed in mode of what you're hovered over. Like I said, the least useful of the three, but you might find you need it at some point, so it's worth knowing about. The reason I don't think it's particularly useful, however, is because you try and work within your super zoom and it will quit the second you click. Yeah. So I've no idea why it's particularly useful, but let's say you've got a large site and you want to quickly zoom in and show someone something, could be useful. The other two are quite useful, however. So the second thing that I want you guys to have a go with is the letter B on your keyboard. This works in both plan view, so 2D and 3D view. So holding B activates the X-ray magnifying glass. This is very useful. So in 3D, it's pretty cool. As you can see here, I can see inside in X-ray view anything I want to show the internals of. So if I was quickly zooming around here and I was talking to the client about, let's say, a staircase in this property, I could just hold B and they could see this staircase that I'm now visualizing on my screen. This is going to be something we're going to use an awful lot because in top plan view, so your 2D view, this is going to be crucially important Now, the reason is when you have a floor plan and you draw over the top of it, you need to see underneath it. Or if you have lots of layers of a building and you want to quickly see through all of the superstructure of that building, holding B will give you an X-ray view of what's underneath. So in this example, I can see through the roof to see through to the first story of this building just by holding the letter on the keyboard. It's very, very, very useful. We will be using that a lot. So B is your X-ray magnifying glass. Super. Cool. And the third function or shortcut that I want to mention in terms of the letters on your keyboard is M. M is a very useful shortcut as well. This is something you're going to use particularly if you've got a powerful machine. So M activates multi-pane view, like so, meaning that I can view my model in a variety of different camera modes. So for example, I might have my plan view on this top section, my front elevation here, and then an isometric view down here. So I can work in different views all at once. As you can see, it activates whatever I'm hovered over in all of the perspectives that I can see. You can also use this, again, if you have a powerful machine, to view one pane in a rendered view, one pane is a plan view, and one pane is a non-rendered 3D view, if you wanted to see what the final render product looked like as you were working. So multi-pane is a very interesting, useful tool to know about as well. If you want to deactivate multi-pane, you just press M again and it'll shoot back to your individual panes. It can be particularly useful. But again, it will use more processing power, so that's something worth bearing in mind.